Hello and welcome to today's webinar, which is part of the Upera Talks series. My name is Sabina Einwiller and I'm a member of Upera's Board of Directors. On behalf of the board, I cordially welcome you to this webinar on gender, freelancing, and flexible working schemes in the communication industries. For those who are joining us for the first time, let me briefly introduce Upera, the European Public Relations Education and Research Association. Our 550 plus members are academics and professionals, primarily from Europe, but our membership expands even beyond the continent. Upera's focus is on fostering a community of passionate researchers and educators in public relations and strategic communication. We do that primarily through the thematic networks and projects, as well as during our annual Congress. And also, of course, related activities such as webinars. By the way, all recordings of our webinars are available on the Upera website under www.upera.org/webinars. The Women in PR network that is organizing today's webinar is one of Upera's thematic networks. It is dedicated to advancing knowledge on gender, leadership, and professional inequality in public relations. It brings together scholars from across Europe and beyond. Research conducted by the Women in PR network has generated some of the most comprehensive cross-national evidence on gender equality in public relations. Studies have documented persistent pay gaps, the glass ceiling in leadership roles, and the cultural and structural factors that limit women's career mobility across European communication industries. The network's comparative work has highlighted national differences in organizational cultures, professional norms, and work-life policies, showing how these shape women's opportunities and constraints. And recent projects have also examined flexible work, freelancing, emotional labor, and well-being, revealing how gendered expectations continue to structure professional identities and everyday practices in public relations. And collectively, the research has helped reframe gender equality in public relations as a systemic and organizational issue rather than an individual challenge. It's now my great pleasure to give the floor to Martina Topic-Rutherford, who is the leader of the Women in PR network.
Thank you very much for this lovely introduction. As Sabine has nicely introduced me, I'm leading a Women in PR network and have done that for many years. And I'm very pleased to moderate today's webinar. So the webinar today is based on two publications that we are publishing as part of the network. Both publications are published with a British publisher, Emerald. So Corporate Communications Journal and book series, Women, Economy and the Labor Relations. I'm an editor-in-chief of both of those publications, and I've supported the network in publishing, also with support from Emerald, which always supports our research. And Emerald is indeed an Upera partner. They are the publisher of Upera Annual Congress, which is a very popular book series. So for those watching this webinar, please consider Corporate Communications Journal and the book series for your work. I'll be happy to consider it, as well as Emerald, or indeed consider any Emerald publications. So now, having praised our Upera partner, Emerald, I'm pleased to introduce webinar speakers. So first, Dr. Anca Anton from the University of Bucharest, Romania. Anca is also Upera PR director, and she's the editor of these two publications we are discussing today, so she will introduce titles and more about that work. Also, we are very, very pleased to have Professor Ralph Tench from Leeds Beckett University in the UK, who has researched freelancing for over 20 years and who has agreed to join us today and provide an expert insight. Ralph Tench is also a former president of Upera, and he currently serves as a research director of Leeds Business School in the UK. And finally, last but not least, Kaylee Thompson, a PhD student at the University of Alabama in the US, who has reviewed Anka's book and who is also working on a doctoral dissertation about women and leadership in PR. Now I will start with Anka Anton, who is our guest editor of these two international publications. So today's discussion basically explores freelancing and flexible work in communication industries, which is part of Anka's research interests. And this has been theorized since 2000, so for a long time, but we didn't have two big comprehensive volumes, and not that much has been published so far. So Anka has contributed to this research gap, and then she will tell us now briefly about those two publications. So if our lovely assistant behind the stage could just start with slides, please. Thank you. So
Right.
Anka, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to present this work. So this is a project that actually started 5 years ago. This is the culmination of it, the book and the special issue. So this is a project started during the pandemic with Raluca Moise, my other co-editor for the book. And we were looking at freelancing. We started developing some independent research, and we realized just how much there was to look at and how little research that there was on this topic. So this kind of became a cumulative research project. We went on with it, and then we proposed to the Opera network and to our Opera colleagues to do a little bit of a deep dive into the topic and to see how different realities were reflected in different geographical spaces. So what came out of this is actually two projects supported by the Opera Women in Power Relations Network, and as Martina said, with her support from the editorial side, and not only. So we first have this book that is called Gender and Freelancing in the Communication Industries. We went a little bit broader to look a little bit at, let's say, common patterns, and we looked at experiences, practices, and discourses. And in this book, you'll see a lot of topics approach from this empowerment and precarity perspective. And one of the things that, or two other things that are very interesting about this book, and I'm looking forward to Kaylee's perspective on this, is on the one hand, different geographical perspectives, but also a quite nice variety of methodologies employed in different chapters. So you'll see work coming in from Portugal, from Poland, from Slovenia, from the UK, from the US, from Singapore, quite a lot of that. But you also see qualitative work, quantitative work quite nicely. And Martina, if you run through the slides, you will get a chance to see a little bit, for example, gender discourses. You see precarity empowerment. We did try to link our research on freelancing with the work that was being done in different other projects within the Women in PR network. So we saw a lot of intersections there, and it's one of the reasons why you will see this gender and freelancing perspectives coming together, highly relevant for the topic. Right. So again, this feminist. This is an autoethnography, which was an interesting methodology to use. Networking, again, quite a central element, and maybe we can get to talk about this a little bit later. Then we have a lot of discussion on freedoms and constraints, again related to the empowerment and precarity duality that is quite central to this. I'm very glad to offer this possibility to compare perspectives from different societies. We tend to think about freelancing in the communication industries as a monolith. It's not. The experiences do have their particular traits. Again, it's sometimes good to compare. So, for example, we have here a comparative study on Romania and Poland. While they both have, let's say, communist background in terms of the setup of the labor market, there are different ways in which freelancers approach the realities of that market. Then this is a very interesting dive into sex, sexuality, and sexism, and also connected to a generational approach. Quite a lot of perspectives on this, and I really like that we do have some very interesting deep dives into the topic. Again, we didn't only look at let's say mature or adult practitioners, but also at the students' perspective. We did see that freelancing is an increasingly relevant topic. It's not as marginal as it used to be. So it is important to think about how to prepare our students for this reality that they will encounter in the workforce. And then we looked at Bourdieu is always such an interesting way to approach anything that has to do with power dynamics, with gender imbalance, with of course habitus, right? So it's quite a lot of perspective that you'll see. And then we said, okay, freelancing is one flexible working schemes, but the diversity is so rich. So we went a little bit further, and we actually did these two projects at the same time. This one is done not just with Raluca Moise, but also with Lea Hellmüller from City University of London. And we try to look not just at communication industries, but also at media industries and at the connected tissue that is there. And we hope that this special issue will, well, the articles are out. We just have to talk a little bit with the editor-in-chief to see when the special issue will become an issue. But luckily enough, this is already research that you can read and consult in the early size section of Corporate Communication International Journal. So you have here the topics that were addressed in this special issue. Yes, so that's in a nutshell. Let's say the result of this 5-year project. Very, very interesting, and it really allowed us to do a deep dive into what freelancing meant in the current era. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. If our assistant from the backstage could remove slides, thank you very much. So I just wanted to start the discussion and start with you, Anka, and ask, so your book charts like an international perspective on gender and freelancing across many countries. So I wanted to ask if you could just outline briefly how freelancing and flexible work has changed and how it has been conceptualized differently in early 2000s versus 2020s.
It does look like it's just around the corner, like the 2000s. It's whenever I think about it, it's like it's a few years ago, and it's like 25 years ago. It's quite a lot. So there's been a lot going on, right? So, and I will talk about this primarily through the lens of our book and special issue, but also through maybe my personal experience, because in the 2000s I was working in a public relations firm, and then when I left the firm, I actually continued my collaboration with them as a freelancer. So I did get to live that experience for a few years, and then after moving to academia, I continued consulting and doing freelance work. So this is actually something quite close to my heart. So I would say that in the 2000s, maybe early 2000s, let's start there. So freelancing in public relations and I can actually say the wider communication industries was mainly seen or let's say conceptualized, right, as a non-standard, as a typical form of employment, right? It was kind of marginal. It sat at the margins of the profession. So I'm really glad that we have Ralph with us, and I'm looking forward to seeing his perspective. But our own research heavily relied on the studies that he did, Fielden, Fox, others, focused on the UK studies. And what we saw is that freelancing was framed largely around these questions of work-life balance, of job satisfaction, of well-being in general, and it did have a strong gender angle, right? It did have this liberal feminist logic, and we do see that those perspectives are still present in the discussion, even today. But a lot of the times freelancing was seen as a lifestyle choice, really, right? So and this was particularly relevant for women, right? So it was a lifestyle choice, more or less forced, to gain flexibility around care, to escape this rigid agency structure, which can become truly rigid, right? This choice idea, but as a marginal modus operandi, was really present. So if we look at the literature, I would say is that we have a feminization literature, right? So we have glass ceilings, we have research on pay gaps, we have this discussion on technical versus managerial roles, but the whole discussion is quite along the lines of organizational careers, right? So not necessarily freelancers, they were there, but they were this extension of the velvet ghetto, right? So this, to some extent, changes by the 2020s, and our conceptual lens is situated there. So things change. How do they change? Actually, we do see this in the book, and that's why I mentioned this duality between precarity and empowerment. So in the book, we move from treating freelancing like this individual lifestyle choice, right, lifestyle decision, and we actually treat it as this structural feature of the labor markets, increasingly platformized, right, labor markets. The industry is still feminized, right? So there's still this prevalent feminine dimension to it, but we work more on it being a structural feature, and we move between these contradiction between precarity and empowerment, which I already mentioned. So freelancing is narrated. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. It's still seen, it's still presented, right, as this route, as this pathway to being autonomous, to being self-determined, right? But even empirically, we see, and if there's anyone watching and is a freelancer, you feel that it's still it's still associated with financial insecurity, with dependence on platforms, on being technically savvy, right? So you do have this major role played by unpaid work, by freelancers acting as intermediaries, and you still have the gendered constraints, I think, around care, about networking. This comes a little bit from a different line of research that we did in the UPRERA Women in PR network. But for example, networking came back, among other traits, came back as one of the stressors associated with women more than with men, right? So what we see is that we do have this shift, right? We see it from shifting from a status of women and from being marginal, right, to a more relational view labor. And you'll see in the book quite a variety of topics. We look at virtual professional communities, we look at media narratives, at autoethnographic accounts, survey data, comparative cases, and they all bring this very interesting concepts that kind of nuance professional life. So if I had to put this in a nutshell, so in the early 2000s and in the 2000s overall, the work was conceptualized as, or freelance work was flexible and sometimes empowering, sometimes risky, but it was this individual arrangement, right? And it was marginal to a somewhat stable industry. Now, in the 2020s, things are less stable. We've had a pandemic since. We've had this renewed interest in flexible work. It came to the forefront even more. It became a little bit more normalized. So the perspective basically sees freelancing as structural, as embedded into how communication work is organized, right? And the lens is increasingly one of precarity and increasingly one of power over one's professional destiny. The discussion is not, I would say, not just about flexibility. Flexibility is still there, but there's so much more nuance that comes into play. In a nutshell, there's quite a lot coming out of the book that it's interesting and really worth exploring. Yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting. And I wanted to ask then, how do these theoretical shifts reflect broader trends and transformations in media and communication labor markets?
Okay. So it's I would say that we still need to look at what were the major factors, the influencing factors that affected how communication work was done. Because in the early 2000s, for example, I'm starting with the early 2000s, we did have this impact of platformization and of social media, kind of really starting to replace a lot of the traditional work. And then in the 2020s, we've had the pandemic, who really turned things on their heads. So in the 2000s, I would say the dominant model was the agency model, the in-house employment, and freelancing was a safety valve, or something that people did maybe after redundancy or after maternity, or at a particular life stage, or for example, like I did something you did in addition, or in a transitional stage, right? I was moving towards academia. I was doing my PhD. Now, in terms of flexibility, the market was still flexible, but we did not necessarily have this embedded atypical contracts, right? They were growing in numbers, but the market was not fully platformized. The profession was still, the communication profession, public relations profession was still very linear, I would say, and it was focused mostly around stable organizations, either firms or in-house departments, right? So we do have several things that change. We had the financial crisis, we had austerity over austerity, we had an increase in digitalization, we had the pandemic, which was the mother of all dynamics. Right? So this I think pushed organizations towards project-based work, towards outsourcing. I would say towards maybe smaller, leaner core teams, to some extent, if we're looking at it from a managerial perspective, it was a way to optimize budgets. So at the same time, when this was happening, we have social media, we have content marketing, we have influencer culture, we have different types of modes emerging, blurring boundaries between different silos to some extent, between journalism and public relations, between PR and marketing, between all of them and creative industries. So this is something that actually came out of different studies that are in the book, left to right, I would say. Portugal, there was something in Poland, Romania, Turkey, quite interesting things coming out. But what we saw was that the freelance communication work was no longer peripheral, was no longer marginal, and it was a way for the industry to actually absorb risk cost routinely, right? So to some extent, freelancers actually became central nodes, in the value chains that organizations deal with, and in the profession. So they moved not necessarily in a central role, but they were no longer peripheral. Right.
Okay, thank you.
Or other
That
things, but
was
I would
that was a very
focus.
good answer and very interesting. I'm going to move to Kaylee now and ask her about her reading of the book, because Kaylee wrote a review. And you examine, Kaylee, how contemporary feminist communication and labor scholarship responds to the issues of autonomy, visibility, and mobility. So what continuities and ruptures do you see between early and current theorizing on gender and freelancing?
Yeah, great question. What I was kind of noticing while I was reviewing this book is past literature within public relations and feminist work focuses a lot specifically on describing inequalities within women and working kind of in the traditional structures of working within public relations. So it's highlighting a lot more things like unequal workloads, limited decision-making power, and sometimes just outright disregard of women's kind of efforts and work within the workforce. So I believe that currently that's still being something contemporarily studied within feminist research. However, kind of the rupture that's taking place that I noticed within this book and among other current literature in this field is kind of the conditions of communications labor. And I think Anka did a great job of kind of explaining that with the pandemic, a lot of people had to move online. And kind of those traditional structures and power structures that women have faced, they've started to change, right? Because people are going and moving online and working there. And then freelancing as an option of work is becoming more and more popular for women, because so many of those traditional power structures that would kind of keep them back, I'm thinking about more like maternity leave policies. Women are choosing to work freelancing because they have more power. They have autonomy of choosing their time. They have more mobility around kind of choosing how they're going to work and when they're going to work. And that kind of gives them that empowerment. However, there's kind of some change that kind of these structures continue to follow, just in different ways. And that's kind of where that precarity and empowerment kind of duality kind of comes into play there, because although women are choosing these freelancing positions and they feel more visible and they have more mobility and autonomy, there's also some things that kind of still follow kind of from those traditional structured systems. Like they don't really get options to choose to lead. They're kind of all on their own and they're solo and working in these fields. And there was plenty of work kind of in this book that kind of highlights the isolation that women face in this kind of area. There's kind of that lack of community and there's ways to go around that. But that's kind of something that they're facing, and also financial precarity. They don't have the kind of that just resources to kind of back them up, or like agency or institutional resources to back them up. So that's kind of where we're seeing like traditional feminism research in this field is kind of still wanting to look at those inequalities, wanting to see those things. But ruptures are taking place in this field just by the modalities of how people are working today. So that was really interesting to kind of see that shift by reading this book. So that was kind of interesting to see.
Okay, so could we say could we kind of I don't know, could we say that, or could we even open a question on whether new forms of digital visibility are altering traditional gender constraints, or whether they simply reconfigure them?
Yeah, and that's a great question to kind of follow up what I was kind of getting at for the last question. I do believe that kind of the digital age within feminist research has been changing a lot. We're kind of considered in this fourth wave of feminism with the advent of technology and how people are communicating kind of gender through technology. So that's kind of an interesting thing. So I 100% believe that digital visibility is giving women more freedom. I think that's where the empowerment comes into. They're going into these spaces. One of the projects in this book was kind of talking about how women speak to each other and find community on digital platforms to kind of talk about freelancing and connect with each other. And they're given more options to advocate for themselves and find better kind of employment and situations for them through digital technology. So I believe that is definitely happening. Empowerment is happening through digital visibility. But again, I also think that kind of old gender constraints still find ways to continually be reinforced, even in these new digital spheres. Kind of where we were talking about just kind of what I was talking about with the last comment, where it's just like, there's also kind of this dark side of freelancing, where it's like women who choose this or feel like they're choosing this for better workplace flexibility at home, being in charge of their time, not really having to deal so much with bosses and kind of managers and things like that. They're their own boss. That's really appealing to women, especially around my age. However, when you start to kind of take that apart, kind of the reasons why they're choosing freelancing, they're all great options. However, if you kind of dig a little bit deeper, you can hear, oh, well, they're choosing freelancing because they want more flexibility, because they can't get that in a traditional environment, right? Or they're choosing flexibility because they don't really want to deal with managers or not being listened to in meetings. So they're going to just be their own boss and do it there. So if you kind of start kind of digging a little deeper, empowerment is there 100%. But there's kind of these traditional power structures that have been studied historically in this area that are still coming out with this kind of advent of freelancing and kind of women's move to freelancing. So in my book review, I kind of asked the question, which I think would be interesting future research: are women really choosing freelancing, or are they kind of still being forced to by kind of the state of the systems within organizational, traditional organizations that are kind of forcing them to move into this space? So that's kind of an interesting question. And I think different women would have different answers, but I think that kind of has more meat to kind of understanding in the future what's going on here exactly.
Okay, thank you. That's really interesting, and actually leads nicely into questions I was meant to ask our next speaker, Ralph, who studied freelancing in the communication industries for a very long time. I mentioned that before. So looking back 2 decades later, where do you see real evolution, and where do structural dynamics look remarkably similar?
Thanks, Martina. Yeah, you're aging me. 25 years of ago I did these studies, but I did, just to kind of recap and explain what we did 3 studies over a short longitudinal period, so from 2000 to 2005, and these were empirical studies. So we spoke to freelancers, and what was fascinating was we spoke to freelancers they're in the UK, and we got good responses, but it wasn't just women to start with. But interestingly, where the focus came for the discussion really became much more about the gendered effects of that work. That was where we began to see what was interesting, both when we looked at literature and we began to explore empirically what the findings were saying to us. So yeah, on those 3 studies, there were great similarities each time we looked at them, and very few changes happening. And I'll come to talk about that because it's been great listening to both of our speakers, but also reviewing Anka's book and the contributions that we've got, because we are seeing a lot of deja vu and some things that I'll talk about which are as I've touched on, great similarities, and has the dial shifted is the question for us to ask. But what's interesting for me is that I suppose societally we've seen a lot that's changed, in our modern working world. Is, it's digital, it's flexible, all the things that my colleagues have talked about. But I still think we see some of the deep structural inequalities that are there. And we've seen freelancing, as has again been described, it's to some degree, it's more professionalized, it's more of a choice for some, especially for women. But the conditions around it, as again has already been mentioned, are fragile. They still maintain and continue to be fragile, which I'll talk about in a bit more depth in a minute. The other things are this, again, the shifting, particularly after COVID, that affected us worldwide in how we work and how we operate, is this movement towards hybrid and particularly platform mediated work. Arguably, that's opened up opportunities, but it has also then, on the flip side, created some dependencies that we have in work for all of us. And I suppose my work's focused on looking at how, both in that historical work, and it's nice to reflect and being encouraged to reflect from these recent studies and these recent papers that people have written, to look again at how culture, care work that people do when they're in work, some of the organizational norms that we see in our organizations and businesses, and these digital infrastructure we talk about interact to shape who thrives and who struggles in that. But to touch on the major shifts, I've kind of said some of them really, but the first one will be digitalization. The next one is this whole thing about the platformization that's talked about in the book. And then much more is the normalization of having what might be called a flexible career. So we're no longer expected to join, as I did when I first started working in the 1980s, an organization and stay there for life. That is so much more accepted. And freelancing, I think, again, as Anka and others has touched upon, has moved from being something which at certain moments was a stopgap. As was said, you lost your job or you were made redundant and you filled the gap with freelancing. And particularly for women who needed flexibility for rather having a corporate or a mainstream career model. And the digital tools that we've got, they've expanded how we can interact and reach. And freelancers often now operate, some of them are mini agencies that they can operate in how they then work and collaborate with others. So they're no longer sat on their own. They're almost creating these virtual agency teams. And the digital tools, freelancers are able to use them to enhance things like personal branding, and their online platforms, professional networks that are easy to do, because networking was a big issue in the early studies of the 2000s. How do you go from working in an isolated sense in your kitchen to then being able to network, which is a much bigger thing in terms of how you did that, because it was a face-to-face encounter. How do you do that with caring responsibilities, family responsibilities? You're in your home. You haven't got the ability to travel. We can do so much more of that now virtually, and we know that. And here we are today. We could all be sat in a room somewhere in Brussels, but we're not. We're doing this online. And those things just didn't exist in the early 2000s. That wasn't part of the narrative at all. The facts that look similar, I think, for me, are still gendered structural inequalities around gender that we observed. I would argue, and it's been touched upon and it comes up in the book, still persist. Of course, it's a gendered area of our work, as you know from your own work, Martina, in terms of in the communications industry. Women dominate numerically, but perhaps are then worryingly still clustered around lower value parts of the work. As a segue into the work we've done in the ECM, the European Communication Monitor, we've looked at this, and particularly on women and female women in communications and salary, so we can see that data as well, Europe-wide, not just in my comments on the UK. And much of these things that we talk about as benefits, these flexibilities that we see in freelancing, and they can attract us to go into it. At the end of the day, they come at some cost, because the economic performance can be lessened. And there's also the sort of other aspects of power dynamics that I think we've also touched upon in the previous comments, which still exist.
Okay, that's very interesting. So I wanted to ask as like a follow-up, how has the shift to hybrid and platform-mediated work altered the conditions you observed? I mean, if in any way.
Well, first one I think we've talked about a little is that it's normalised it. It's been remote collab and working remotely is normalised, as I think we've already touched upon earlier in these conversations. The COVID affected that, in that we accepted that chief executives could be sat there in their slippers talking to their teams, etc., etc. So working remotely has been removed as a stigma. So not attending the office is no longer a problem, and we this feeling of being 9 to 5 on site every day. As I've touched upon again, and we see in some of the articles that are in the book, platforming tools allow visibility. They allow us to be seen and credible without essentially being present all of the time. But there are still some of the newer challenges around, because I think we all suffer this with work-life boundaries now that we do a lot of our interactions online and from our homes. The sort of boundaries of time have gone for many of us. We're all guilty, particularly academics are guilty of that, but probably more than more. But that's certainly something that is there for the freelancer, because they're always on and always available. There's also, I suppose, this idea of what's talked about. It's in our kind of conversations around this BANI context of we work in society, which is brittle, anxious, non-linear, and incomprehensible. It does amplify for freelancers that insecurity, and they carry some of that, I think, because they're on their own. They're isolated from this kind of collective of a group or an organization, which is, again, that's another challenge.
Okay, that's interesting. So I'll start with you, but I want to ask everyone the same question. So, and you have such diverse perspectives, which is really interesting. So what should organizations, policymakers, and educators take away from this research? And how could PR and media programs prepare students for the future of freelance and flexible labor?
Okay, shall I start, did you say?
Yeah, yes, please.
Well, I mean, the first thing is I think we've got to accept in organisations that freelancers are part of a communication workforce. A lot of agencies use freelancers, a lot of businesses use freelancers, and we need to treat them. I suppose that's part of it for the organisation, is treating them as integrated and integral to that. I think the other thing is around ensuring that we have transparency around payment terms, how we're paid, when we're paid. Some of those they were problems back in the day in terms of late payment, non-payment, and how do we manage that when freelancers are working, because that is precarious financially and leaves people vulnerable. For policymakers, I think that we need to think about protections. I mean, these could come from professional associations, like I said, protecting them against things like late payment. Maternity and paternity rights, access to training, and maybe that should be something that professional associations should think about. How do we do that? How do we make that affordable? Because the other problem that we have when you're a freelancer, if you're not working, you're not paid. If you're on holiday, you're not paid. And these are big issues that I think that are still with us. I think we should also think, how can we somehow integrate some of those benefits that we get in organizations, sickness cover and other things? How do we perhaps help as policymakers to ensure, because this is a part of the workforce that isn't going anywhere, how do we sustain it and keep it alive? For us as educators, I think we are already, I certainly talk about preparing students for a portfolio career. Many of us use that language, but we're not just training them to go into agency or to go into a large corporate. We're training them to be obviously freelance, but that requires a degree of thinking about them as an entrepreneur, as a self-starter, someone who will have to do and manage their career trajectory individually. And so for us, we need to think about preparing them for that, build those skills, and build our curriculum around those portfolio careers, things like self-promotion and also negotiation skills, because they're going to be having to sell themselves regularly. Things around digital platform literacy, obviously, all of the usual things connected to AI that will help them. And emotional resilience, I think, is important, because they're going to take, it's tough. You know, it can be very tough, can be lonely. You get high points and low points. There's fallow periods economically. And as I've said, I think entrepreneurship is key to that. I think we should be teaching much more about entrepreneurial skills for our students. How do they survive in a world like that? And then also teaching them to navigate some of the more gendered-based ecological factors that are there around networking, boundary setting, and managing the precariousness that's been highlighted by my colleagues as well.
Okay, that's very interesting. The same question for you, Kaylee, if you would like to add something.
Yes, I would love to. I was kind of more thinking specifically about what educators can take away from this research. That kind of goes hand in hand to your second question about what media and PR programs should kind of think about while talking about freelancing. And I think the greatest thing, because I kind of recently got my undergraduate in PR. It's been a couple years now, but freelancing was never even brought up as an option within our courses. It was literally just like, how do you prepare yourself for going into an agency-based, organization and structure? So first of all, just talking about this as an option in the first place would be something that I think a lot of programs need to kind of include in their curriculum. And also having more experiences, like women and men who have worked in freelancing coming in and actually talking about their experiences. If they're kind of having to have kind of that entrepreneur spirit, kind of coming in and actually talking to students and sharing how they did that and where they got started. So students, especially, in this research, young women were starting to really care about wanting to go into kind of freelancing and flexible work environments, giving kind of those voices to the people who've done it before them so they can really understand exactly what they're getting into, the pros and the cons.
Oh, that's a very interesting perspective from a recent graduate. Anka, would you like to add something?
Yes, just to kind of echo a little bit of what Kaylee was saying. When I first started, going a little bit more in depth into this topic, that was actually the starting point, because I realized we were not talking to our students about freelancing, and I was actually doing freelancing. So I was thinking, why am I not talking to my students about this? So the idea is that we do actually need a substantial shift in how we teach public relations and communication, from talking to students about how to get a job to actually how to navigate, a non-linear professional path. Because that's actually what awaits a lot of us, even us in academia. A lot of us do consultancy. A lot of us have parallel professional paths. So why aren't we talking to our students about this? And why aren't we preparing them more about this? And I think that one thing we need to do in relation to that is actually supporting them develop a strong and critical professional identity. Because what path are you navigating if you don't understand the path you are on, right? And if you are switching from one path to another, how do you understand those paths if you don't have a critical approach to this, if you don't understand the profession well? So for example, I recently did something on professional fluidity from media to communication industries, and there's a whole transitional universe there that it's difficult to understand for a student if you don't understand the idea of professional identity, professional practice, and professional universe. So this is one thing that I think we as educators need to shift in how we approach things. And related to organizations and governments, I think it's important to understand that this shift, this change of place, this shift from being marginal to not necessarily central but important in the value chain, of communication, of freelancing. This is not something that came out of a superior maturity level of the industry or of society. It is something that was forced by technical changes, social media in particular, and by societal and health issues, namely the pandemic. So they did not come to the forefront because we saw this, additional value in freelancing. It's just that it happened. So now I think that both the industry, the profession, and administrative structure, governmental structures need to catch up with the reality. Because right now, and maybe particularly because it's such a gendered issue, it's not seen as urgent, important, or central. So I was actually researching with Raluca during the pandemic, and we were looking at what the UK government was doing, related to workers, to furloughing, to all those things, and there was not a lot actually done for freelancers. Actually, there was some legislation coming into law that actually worked against some of the freelancers. So I don't think that the government is still, or governments understand the realities of freelancing or the value of freelancing, and I think that the industry is still not necessarily willing to share the costs and the risks that professionals that go into freelancing take on, although they benefit from the work of those professionals, right? So I think that some industry and profession-wide empathy and support structures and systems do need to come to become a reality, and that's why we need this professional identity to become something more than something we talk about. It needs to become something we practice. So I am a little bit skeptical about positive things happening in the near future, but I think that we need to insist in talking about this, because that's how you normalize practices, and it's difficult to not pay attention to things that are normalized.
Okay, that's really interesting, and you kind of partially answered my next question, but I wanted to ask, what identities and competencies should future professionals be trained to develop? And this is a question for everyone. I'll just start with you now.
Yes. So there are two things. A little bit, I'm echoing what Rolf was saying about the entrepreneurial perspective. So if I look at my students right now, my communication students, when I say the word budget, everyone just scatters wherever they find a place to hide themselves, right? So an Excel should not be your worst enemy, right? I can honestly say that I understood my work, the practicality of my work, when I compared my creative proposal to my Excel and to my budget proposal. I mean, this is not something to shy away from. We do need to enable our students to understand the financial realities of their profession, whatever those realities are. So that's one thing. The other part, and I'm approaching this primarily from an academic perspective, from a teaching perspective. Another thing is that in some way we need to help our students navigate social norms. They've really been affected by the pandemic. That's the reality. I mean, some of them don't have the social norm, the social skills that we kind of took for granted. So they are not just in need of social skills for this new setup. They are behind on the traditional social skills that they would have. So there's a gap there that I don't think we are prepared to tackle. And maybe we do need to become a bit more aware about that. And I'm wondering exactly how the industry is preparing, or if it's preparing at all, to really understand, not just study, but actually critically look at what they're doing and what comes next, in societal terms, because that will need a major shift. It's just the reality. And I think all the parts involved are not necessarily ready, and we are in a negotiation process where I really do hope that the parties involved do not struggle for more power or more position of power, but rather a collaboration position.
Okay, Kaylee, the same question, please.
Oh, okay. I mainly was thinking about kind of 3 words kind of for future professionals: accountability, creativity, and understanding. So what I've kind of seen trend-wise in accountability is, especially for students going into fields that are flexible or they are freelancing, they need to be accountable for actually getting their work done, right? They are their own managers. So learning how to manage themselves is going to be something very important that they're going to have to learn, that I feel like is also a skill that's kind of slowly being lost, kind of with the advent of technologies and kind of the digital sphere. And then creativity and authenticity kind of along with that. Students need to learn that they can't just like type in ideas to an AI chatbot and then just go from there and feel like that was kind of something they came up with themselves. They need to learn that they need to be coming up and thinking critically, coming up with solutions, being problem solvers within public relations, instead of just relying on kind of this crazy technology that we're seeing today, to use it, but not to only rely on it. And then kind of that last kind of word that I was kind of thinking about is just connection. We're in an isolated situation kind of overall in society. And I feel like students these days really feel that. So being taught, I'm kind of going with Anka's point of learning to connect with other people, not just self-isolating, not just working alone, but learning how to collaborate, because communications is a collaborative field. So learn how to do that. So those are kind of the 3 things that were on my mind, thinking about future professionals in the field.
That's very interesting. And then also, Ralph, if you would like to add something about competencies, which is another area of your research, if I remember correctly.
Thank you. Yeah, I actually, what Bill and Kate's just said there, really, and the last one was one I was going to mention, but just to build on it, is I completely agree. I think it's around something I mentioned earlier, which is networks and network builders. We need to get people to be able to build networks, because social capital is key in our industry, and it's the most important differentiator. Being able to have those relationships and networks and build them is what will also create you clients and ultimately work. So that's key for anyone who freelances. The other one then, I just don't think we can get away from it. Colleagues have touched on it, but I think it's around digital confidence, having that, and I use the word confidence with it, because I think we need to be able to confident not only with using platforms and the familiar tools, but actually that goes from being, dare I say it, the data analytics through to personal branding, being able to interpret all the stuff we talk about in teaching our students. But I think it's so valuable that they can interpret and utilize data, but critically as well, they can be questioning of data sources, the veracity and the quality of information that's coming to them. These are the things that will differentiate them, I think, from others and from some peers. And the other one, I suppose, that I've also mentioned again is around their self-management and negotiation, to be able to manage themselves, their time, to work with and negotiate with their clients and whoever they're going to work with.
This is so interesting that you say social capital, because I just actually interestingly authored a new course that is specifically for undergraduate students to build social capital and networks, and that's the assignment. So I almost jumped when you said that. I just have one last question again for all of you. I wanted to ask also, what is the most urgent line of inquiry then for the next decade of gender and communication labor research? And I can start with Anka this time.
Sorry, needed to unmute myself there. That's a lot of things that are urgent. Maybe try to maybe develop research that tries to better understand what actually works to improve conditions and for whom that works. Maybe I was mentioning this negotiation of power between the different agents in this whole system. So maybe try to understand what organizational policies would work, what regulations would work, what would be the new forms of, I don't know, maybe collectively working together. So we were looking in one of the chapters at professional virtual communities. One of the things that came out of that was that freelancers were actually using those virtual communities and the interactions that they got there as a substitute for organizational culture. So really understanding, so moving from that descriptive understanding of exploration of freelancing, and moving towards really understanding what would work and in what conditions for whom, that I think would be the next step in actually doing something relevant and impactful in freelance research.
Okay, what about you, Kaylee? What is your perspective?
Yes, so I'm really interested in leadership and women within public relations. So while I was kind of reviewing this book and kind of reading about freelancing and kind of what women are choosing to do with their careers, my main kind of question and kind of concern is what's happening to women in leadership, right? If there's a huge amount of women choosing freelancing, right? They're leaving kind of these organizational structures. They're leaving corporations where they could climb the corporate ladder and maybe go into management leadership positions. But if women are kind of either being forced or choosing more flexible working arrangements, that leadership and ability to kind of be in those leadership spaces and making decision making, not just for themselves, but for an organization overall, what's going to happen with that, right? Because there's kind of already, there is a leadership gap between the genders within public relations. It's been historically studied. In some ways it's lessening, but in some ways it's still definitely there. And I want to kind of study to see what's happening with this shift to freelancing and overall kind of leadership attainment for women in the field.
Okay, that's a very interesting perspective. And then Ralph, the same question, please.
Well, I could give a long list, but I encourage people to read the book, because there's lots of good ideas in there that trigger and gave me food for thought. But if I could just say one, actually, which I think is one of the things that's worrying me most, is around the fact that worldwide and organizationally wide, we're seeing a kind of rolling back on these EDI initiatives and how we treat people as citizens and as workers, if I could say that. And so it would be interesting to look at and to explore empirically what's happening with that. How is it being played out in different regions, different organizational settings, and its impact ultimately on the independent worker, on someone who's working freelance as well, because it could be, and I'd find that interesting.
Okay, that was all very, very interesting, and we are approaching the end of the webinar. So I just wanted to ask all of the speakers, is there anything that maybe we also need to say and I didn't ask? And also, if there are any questions from our audience, we would be happy to answer. I don't see anything currently in the system. But is there anything I didn't ask that maybe you, Anka, Ralph, or Kaylee think that we should also mention for our audience?
I don't, maybe a little bit connected to what Ralph was saying. I think that I do agree that the most vulnerable will be actually the most affected in all of this rollback on DEI. But I would try to also look at things as culturally contextualized as possible, right? So for example, I was just thinking about something that Kaylee was saying about, you know, this difference between gender, you know, about the gender gap and things like that. So for example, in Romania, we have, actually it's not just a feminized industry, it's a female led industry. So agencies are led by if you find a man, that's actually the outlier, right? Managerial positions in communication are a lot of them actually women. So it's quite interesting to see. To some extent, it's this gender equality is one of the few positive things coming out of communism, you know. But it's so interesting to see how you know, these patterns play across different countries and different cultures. Maybe try to understand what works in one and if it can be replicated in another space, or maybe try to find the starting point for maybe a policy or you know, an industry dynamic or something like that to change things a little bit.
Very interesting. Anyone else? Okay. Well, I think we have now basically completed our webinar. Thank you very much for your very interesting talks and answers to my questions. You left me with a lot of prospective future projects, and maybe next webinar can be, you know, research and well-being, because I have a lot of food for thought. So thank you for joining us today, and thanks to everyone who is watching the webinar, and please connect with us on LinkedIn and indeed with you, Prera.